I have planned for today to say some things about books 5 through 8. So again, we're doing books 5 through 8. If you remember back in the Republic, there's several things to think about as far as the formation of the city. Basically, we're talking about 735 to 850 at this point. The section I'm going to deal with now is 735 to 850. The Republic deals mostly with the soul. And specifically, what is the soul of the leaders? So now, in this part of the laws, we're going to deal with, well, what are the actual institutions you need to set up? And I think it's important in Plato to never get bogged down in the details. I mean, on the one hand, the details reveal to you something. But the point always is to look at the details to try to get from the details, what is the point he's driving at? Right? What is the principle he's driving at? What is the insight into human nature he's driving at? Too often, I think, when people read Plato, they get stuck in, well, is this thing going to work or not? And I think Plato realizes that he's not trying to give you necessarily what's going to work. He's trying to give you a principle that when you're immersed in your circumstances, you got to keep that principle in mind. And I think he's also willing to realize, look, sometimes the science of these things is not fully figured out. So he's leaving it to a future generation to figure out what's the actual science of how you realize this principle. Okay, so I think if you don't keep that in mind, you can get lost in the laws. So, book 5, beginning at 735, we're dealing with the regime. And the regime is the people, the regime is, R equals the souls of the leaders, plus the institutions, plus the means by appointing the people to those institutions. Right? That's kind of the regime. And then from that will flow, who are we dealing with here?
I'm not sure.
Sister Laurentia. The Ukrainian Sisters of St. Joseph of Saskatoon. Wow.
Picked it up somewhere.
So, from the regime will flow the laws. Right? From the regime will flow the laws, the customs, what is right reason. Right? All sorts of things. The first problem, actually it's interesting to look at the first problem. What is the first problem? The first problem is the family and property. Well, actually, the first 3 big problems are the family, property, and education. If you can get the family, property, and education right, you can guarantee the long-term stability of the regime. The problem is it is very hard to get those things right. The family, property, and education are very fragile institutions. By the way, also too, there's so many things about Plato that resonate with the church's teaching. Right? The church basically says the most important thing is the family, and then education. Catholics almost throughout history need to fight so that the laws keep the family strong, support the family and keep it strong, and also they need to fight for freedom and education. Because those are the things that guarantee the stability of the regime.
My favorite line in book 5 is the first thing you need to do in a city is establish a law for marriage.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah. But also another big thing here, and again, this is not foreign to the church, is the problem of economic distribution. This is an issue we faced last spring in this seminar, in this family establishment, right? Where one of the things that Hilaire Belloc pointed out in those books that we read is that if you look at economics over time, between the time when Christianity basically became the culture, or the defining aspect of the culture in the West, which was, let's say, 300 or 400, between that time and 1500, you start to see the elimination of slavery. You start to see more just economic distribution of land. You start to see property associated with families, and then as basically beginning in 1500 until now, as Christianity is being removed from Western culture and institutions, you start to see a return of slavery, which we get in the modern world, and then you also start to see a return of the servile kind of economic relationships that defined Greek and Roman culture. These vast disparities between rich and poor, where basically the rich, even the people who weren't slaves, could be treated almost as slaves by the wealthy, and that wealth becomes more and more concentrated in the hands of a few. So it's fascinating when you think about it, that how did the church develop its, we have the social doctrine of the church. How did the church develop its social doctrine in the 19th and 20th centuries? Did it do it by studying Marxism? No. Did it do it by studying capitalism and just appropriating what's best from capitalism? No. Basically, the church went back and it tried to glean what would be the economic and political advice that we could get from the fathers of the church. And it developed principles that came from the teaching of the fathers of the church. In other words, what the fathers of the church told the Christians to do in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries. That's where the principles of the soul. And then they said, now how can we articulate these principles in a way that is palatable or can be understood by modern people? And that's what Benedict is huge on. Throughout his whole career, he's been huge on this. There was this whole faction, and maybe faction is not the right term to give to it, but there was this whole faction in the Second Vatican Council that basically said, the way you update what the church teaches is by learning very well what the fathers of the church taught. And that was Benedict, right? So Benedict really, he spent a lot of his time just reading Augustine. And actually I think more and more St. John Chrysostom is relevant to our own time. Because he lived in Antioch, which there's one homily where St. John Chrysostom says, basically there was this garden in Antioch, and apparently all the young people would go to this garden on Sundays, Saturdays and Sundays, and they would walk like 4 miles to go to this garden. But this garden was like where they played Dionysian music there, and people would run around and do Dionysian things. Dionysus is the goddess of love. The Bacchic frenzies, things like that.
Not love, but passion.
Passion, yeah, passion. Sorry, good point. So, and Chrysostom in one of his homilies, he says, don't go to the garden. Don't listen to that music. Stay away from the theaters, because you're just going to be lured through these things into sinning in a big way, to offending God. And he laments, he says, probably 90% of the young people are led astray in this way in his city. Right? So,
rock music's the beat of fornication, right?
Well, yeah. Yeah, that's right, yeah. That's right. So obviously, the family is important, education important, economics are important. One of the big dangers of the long-term stability to the regime is the unjust distribution of land. So the legislature, when you're thinking about economic institutions, you need to think about ways of redistributing the land such that not that there's strict, and again, he's very important about this. You don't need strict equality. You need proportional equality. Okay? You don't need strict equality. You need proportional equality. You need a proportion that allows for stability within the society, that enables you to have defense, that enables you to distribute food, and that in other words, you need a proportion that enables overall stability. You also need the proportion that allows for unity. And unity the ideal unity you want in a city is when the citizens see themselves as friends, and because they see themselves as friends, they're willing to hold all things in common. And they're willing to hold all things in common because they have a unity of thought, a unity of sentiment, and a unity of their inclinations. So what he kind of articulates here is what we call the right to private property, but also the universal destination of goods. Right? The basic principle of economic distribution is that you need the right to private property, but also the people who have private property should be detached from their wealth, personally detached from it, and they should want to make as much as possible their wealth destined for the common good. Again, a lot of the stuff we're dealing with in the laws in the next 3 or 4 chapters or books, we're not necessarily talking about what has to be dictated by law. Some of it Plato is willing to say, well, maybe you can only do this by education or by custom, unwritten law. So he's not necessarily defining what combination of law and custom and education will bring about this ideal. And actually, as I was reading these 5 or 6 books, I was thinking that in many ways, right, the ideal city would be a monastery, right? Or it would be a community that's surrounding a monastery. Or the first Christians, in some sense, lived the ideal community. If you read the Acts of the Apostles, they fulfilled many of the criteria that he lays out of the ideal community. One of the things he says about money is that the pursuit of money should be last on the scale of honor. And I think the point here is not that there should not be wealthy people, but it's just that wealth should not be a criteria of honor. And again, St. James says this, right? He says, it's not what's important. Is it the altar and the sacrifice on the altar, or is it the money that someone gives? This is our Lord, right? The sacrifice someone gives for the money on the altar. St. James says to the first Christians, don't give special pride of place to the rich man just because he has money. Right?
How could Notre Dame exist?
Well,
he has to drink some wine. A question like that. Oh man.
I think actually, I think I can say this, and I think I can say this without being punished. I think if you look at the history, it's not just the problem of Notre Dame. I think it's the history of Catholics in this country. Catholics in this country, because of the various ways they have been a minority culture, either in the Protestant culture or in what is now this kind of this promiscuous culture that we live in right now. Whatever you want to, we could disagree about what it is. But I think because of that, we have a tendency to basically want to protect the church by protecting the reputation of the church. And I think the danger there is that we become more concerned with reputation than with doing what is good. And again, as Plato describes in the Republic, as soon as you become more concerned with reputation than virtue, you're going to run the risk of letting the man who has money buy reputation. And so I think it's a problem. I think the problem at Notre Dame ultimately is a problem of reputation. We're concerned about our reputation, and we think that, and because of that, we think that now money could buy our reputation. But that's not that. Yeah, but that's not the problem of Notre Dame. That's the problem of Catholics in America. And money can't buy you love, ultimately. All right? No, I think that, but I think ultimately, if you're a Catholic intellectual in the United States, you have to have the attitude of Augustine. I don't care if people give me a good reputation in my lifetime. I am going to set the standard for the next 4 or 5 centuries of what it means to be an intellectual. God will take care of me. Right? In other words, what's your model? Let's say you want to transform the film industry. Well, and you want to produce screenplay writers. The model right now at a typical Catholic university in the United States is we just got to get people in the film industry any way we can. So that there's a Polish guy from South Bend who became a screenplay writer in Hollywood, and they brought him back to South Bend to celebrate his achievements. And his greatest achievement was writing The People versus Larry Flint, which is not, I don't think that's something you'd want to be known for. Larry Flint is the publisher of Hustler magazine, right? So this film was made. This film, in the early '90s, Congress passed a law, the Something Decency Act, with the idea of basically regulating the internet, so you couldn't use the internet to promote pornography, right? To try to block all the spam mail that you get for Viagra and stuff like that. Well, the people in Hollywood wrote this film specifically so that it would go to the Supreme Court, so that this film itself could be used as a case to challenge the Decency Act, the Federal Communications and Decency Act, to strike it down. I mean, this film was, it was the classic example of Hollywood making a film not for the sake of art, but for political reasons.
Why would it strike it down?
Because they would say, well, this is art. This is art, so therefore it's academic freedom, or it's, free discourse. Therefore, even though there's all sorts of pornography in it, we have to let it through.
This may be a bad question to bring up in this class, but I'm just wondering.
There are no bad questions.
Well, no, it's off
There are
topic,
stupid people who ask bad questions, but they don't.
You tell you're a freshman then, do you?
No, go ahead.
What were the constitutional grounds for the amendment in the first place?
What amendment?
Or the Decency Act, not the amendment.
Well, the constitutional grounds are, if you go back to the early 19th century, Congress, for example, in the early 20th century, it regulated interstate prostitution rings. And it basically said, look, there are some things that the states could never regulate, like, international crime or interstate or prostitution rings where the prostitutes live in Louisiana, or they live in Alabama, but they go work every day in Louisiana.
Could I have a bread pudding?
And that way they avoid the laws in both states that would go against them, right? So Congress passed a law saying, well, Congress can regulate interstate commerce to make sure that it keeps that some things can't go through interstate commerce because they're immoral.
Okay.
So that's the basis for it. So, but the other model is, well, can we like the University of the Sacred Heart of Milan? Basically, what they're doing is they're saying, we know the technical details of how to produce a great screenplay writer. So what they say is, we're going to get 30 students a year who have the philosophical and theological training to where they know what good values are. And we're going to give them the technical skills, and then they are going to produce the best plays or the best TVs. So screenplay writers that come out of the University of Sacred Heart in Milan, they write made-for-TV movies for Italian TV, and every time they write something, it's the #1 rating in Italy.
Really?
Yeah. So it's now becoming
You gotta
the,
get them to come over here.
well, all the thing is they have Americans who teach in their school. Yeah, they have American screenplay. Like the guy that wrote Braveheart teaches in their school. You don't need, in other words, you don't need to be Italian to go to their program. And you don't need to conceive of yourself
I think I'm gonna do that.
as writing in Italian to go to their program. Because all they do is the guy that founded the program, he came to the United States and studied American screenplay writing. Because he said American screenplay writing works in every market.
Yeah, it does.
Because the English language and the way of thinking about things in English, it's perfect for screenplays. Because we speak in short sentences. One sentence, you can say a big idea with it. It's not verbosity. There's no Baroque language in English anymore. So it's perfect for screenplay writing. So an American could go there and learn screenplay writing and then come back to America. Or then there's another guy, we learned about this when I was in Rome, there's another guy, an Englishman, who's Catholic, who has started an independent film company in both Spain and England. And it's just for doing films with good values. But it's not explicitly religious. And just this year they came out with their first romantic comedy. But I don't know how it's doing. But that's the kind, in other words, to me, that's what you got to do. It seems like the American model so far is we Catholics got to learn how to suck up to Hollywood, right? So we just get people there who learn to be good kiss asses. No, it's true. And maybe when they're there, they get, the guy writes for Shrek, and he gets a building at Notre Dame into the movie, But that's not transforming the culture. That's kissing the ass of your masters, right? Maybe I shouldn't say that when I'm being recorded. But it seems to me what you want to do is you want to be like Augustine. And you want to say, we can take what is best in the culture and we can do something that's better than what is best in the culture. And that seems to me to be what the Sacred Heart of Milan is doing. And it seems to me to be what this independent film guy is going to do in Spain and England. In other words, we're not going to teach you how to be what does a sophist do? A sophist teaches you what the beast is, and then how to be a clever beast along with the beast. Right? And it seems to me like that's the model of American Catholicism right now. We're not going to critique the beast. We're going to teach you what the beast is and how to suck up to the beast.
Is this just in the people, or do you think it's in the hierarchy of bishops?
I think less and less it's in the bishops. I think for a while it was in the bishops. But I think it's in most of American Catholic universities right now. Still. Less and less it's in the bishops, and I think less and less it's in the young people too. But it's in people of my generation, and it's certainly in people of the generation before mine. Comment?
So wait. This is a really stupid question. I just need clarification.
There are no stupid questions.
Kissing ass
Only
is a
stupid
bad
people
thing?
ask stupid questions.
Yes.
Okay, good. I was just checking because for a while there I thought you were saying it's a good thing. I was like, what?
No.
Okay.
I mean, in other words, I think it's not a good thing.
Okay, good.
Because you're just pandering to your oppressors. You're adopting the morality of those who are oppressing you.
Just got worried there for a second.
No, I think it's awful.
Good. My world was spinning.
No, but my point is that within the Catholic Church in this country, I think there's a tendency towards that model.
Okay.
The suck-up model. Right?
Yeah.
Not just when it comes to films, like when it comes to everything.
Everything.
No, I mean,
Psychology, science, study of history, the study of theology, the study of philosophy.
at the risk of
Anything that
bringing up,
happens at a university.
yeah, at
Yeah.
the risk of bringing up an old
And it's like
conversation,
putting an intellectual contraceptive over your head. Right? That's what it leads to.
That's a picture.
It's like
That's what it
putting
leads to.
intellectual contraceptive over your
Wait,
head.
what's
No,
that?
but
What
that's
is
what
that?
it leads to.
What is intellectual contraception? Didn't you say something like some concept is intellectual contraception?
Well, this is what it is. In other words, adopting the
Plato
mentality.
talks about that. Like the midwife, remember? Like the midwife? Is that what you're thinking of?
No. There's some concept in some specific concept at the university, which is intellectual contraception.
I forgot what I said. But it's recorded, so we can go back and find it.
No, I think Britton told me about it. You told your freshmen this.
I think it might have been this point.
I think it was something like studying philosophy without living it, or something like that. Was being intellectual, like
Maybe. I forget.
Contracepting
I
virtue.
thought it was that you go right up to the ideas of truth, and you come right towards them, and you just cut it off and don't actually.
Oh, was it Heidegger? Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I think that's what it was.
That's right. Did you tell me this?
I don't know. I think Britton. I told Britton, and then Britton must have told me.
Yeah,
I think that's what you said.
that's right. Yeah, you come right up to the truth.
But I mean, in other words, if your mentality becomes, and it's very hard because in academia, you're always looking for money, right? You're always looking for money, and you're always looking for, especially now with like U.S. News and World Report, you're always looking for prestige and money. And so it's very easy to think, well, gosh, I can't say certain things because if I say certain things, I'm going to lose all my money. Right? I won't get promotion. I won't get the corner office with the window. No, it's true though.
I was just wondering, like Charles Taylor, like he got that $1 million whatever
Yeah.
thing, but like, was it partly like just this whole? I don't know.
Yeah, it's because he fawns modernity,
Yeah, he seems to.
right? He worships modernity, so they're going to give him money to keep worshiping modernity.
He doesn't worship it so that he gets money. Like, I actually think he really likes lazy people.
Yeah,
Well, no,
he
I mean,
buys into it.
I know, but the thing is, I think there's a subtle relationship here. He gets promoted and he's a smart guy, but he gets promotions because he likes modernity. McIntyre doesn't get money anymore because he's come out publicly being critical of modernity. Not that even he's fully against it. He's not against it, but he's critical of it in all sorts of ways that makes moderns uncomfortable.
He's a
So
Thomist.
so he doesn't get money
Like,
anymore.
Even the conscious Charles Taylor doesn't like form in that. Or like,
Well, it would be very hard at this point if Charles Taylor were to stand up and say, I'm critical of X, Y, and Z about modernity, they would yank his money.
Well, is that
He would stop
$1 million
getting money
award
like
that he just
McIntyre
got?
did. What?
Is that $1 million award that he just got pretty? Is that his money or?
Well, now it's his money, yeah, but in some sense he's being rewarded. He's not necessarily being rewarded for thinking. He's being rewarded for saying the right
Thinking in a
things
certain
about the right people.
I don't want to bring up this conversation again, really.
Okay.
But
Then don't.
So how does this whole like anti-kiss ass mentality? How does that compatible with the whole go to Harvard so that you can suffer for 7 years and then get tenure at Notre Dame?
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Well, see, the thing is, the world runs on money.
Well, I think it's this. If you can get a good education, right? If you can get a good education and play their game, then do it.
You gotta censor yourself to some degree, right?
Yeah, to some degree. But if you can find something that you're interested in, even though it might not be directly what you want to do, but related to what you want to do, and you're willing to do that for 10 years, then do it.
So you're saying it's okay to lay low, but it's not okay to be intellectually dishonest. Is that so? There's a distinction.
Yes, that's what I would say. Like, for example, I was telling someone today,
Fly below the radar.
if you want to study John Chrysostom, because you want to be Mr. John Chrysostom, I would say to you, do a PhD and write a book on Libanius. Libanius was the last great pagan classicist of the ancient world. And he was the teacher of St. John Chrysostom. Right? So you could do a dissertation on the guy. You could do a dissertation on Libanius. And you could also, study his life and writings and, I don't know, study Libanius. But then in the context of studying Libanius, you could start to basically learn a lot about St. John Chrysostom. And then basically, you do a dissertation on Libanius, you write a book on the guy, or a bunch of articles, you get tenure, and then you talk about Chrysostom the rest of your life. No, I mean, But even if you do that, what will happen to you is at universities, what will happen to you, if you get tenure, and then you start writing things that make the university not happy with you, they will freeze your salary. They can't fire you, but they will freeze your salary.
How can they do that?
They still pay you.
They still pay you.
There's no raises, right?
They don't give you a raise. They freeze your salary. You can't use the secretaries. They limit your travel funds.
Okay.
So in other words, you'll still be punished eventually.
So
You'll still be made. You won't get invited to any university committees. You'll be excluded from the decision-making processes of the university. Right? So that's the dilemma of being an academic in the 20th century in Catholic universities. If you choose to write about
poverty.
if you choose to write about things that explicitly come to bear on Catholic faith and morals, you end up like me.
If you're going to be an intellectual, don't get married.
Ralph McInerney just wrote a book that basically blows 90% of present-day Thomists, or self-claimed Thomists.
What's the name of the book?
Preambula Fidei.
Oh, really?
The common Thomist, like people that call themselves Thomists in the theology department say, like they downplay the fact that he was a philosopher too. They downplay the fact that he, and so Ralph McInerney, like this is like the apologia of the Thomist, and that must be really nice to be that old and retired and be able to get away with that kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
His son's having problems, right?
Yeah.
He's what?
Poor guy.
He's having
Okay, back to Plato. I paused us for that little excursion.
That was wise. So
It's interesting, just to note in Greek, arche, A-R-C-H-E, it means the same thing as the rule of the city. It means also the beginning of the city. And it also means the first principles.
It's pretty cool.
Right?
I love Greek.
So, ultimately there's a section in here where he speaks about the different institutions you want to set up. And basically what he describes is how you need a republican form of government. You need a president or a monarch. You need a legislature, and you need a judiciary. The important thing to remember is that while this looks a lot like America, you could say, there's no conception of individual rights in this setup. There's hardly any claims that the individual can make against the state. So that's a big difference between, let's say, what Plato describes and what John Locke would describe, where the foundation is the claims that the individual could make against the state. So, the most important thing in the city, as we said, are the rulers, their souls, the offices of the city, and the institutions. The most important thing for the long-term stability is the education. And if you want to know the long-term nature of a city, you need to look to the souls of the founders. There's a guy in PLS named Kent Emery who studies the history of universities. And if you ever want like 5 hours of pessimism, talk to him. But
somebody just told me that same thing this week. They said if you want to hear an hour's worth of just depressing ranting.
But at the same time, there is something insightful about pessimism. Is that you should always be willing to admit the brutal facts. So someone like that can be helpful, actually, just in understanding what are the brutal facts. So, one of the things that Ken Emery told me is that in his study of the history of universities, his area of expertise is the history of universities, especially medieval universities. And he says that it's true. You can look at oftentimes the founders of a university, and it's almost as if within the spirit of the founders, there's like a genetic code that is set for the university. And that's what Plato is saying about cities and countries. That if you look to the founders and you look at their souls, you can see the genetic code of the city. Because why? They articulate what becomes the first principles, the arcade of that city. And actually, the United States is one of the few countries that still takes over. When I was in Rome for the Holy Week, I was with a French friend of mine, and I told him I was studying the French Revolution. He said, that's very important, because we French don't study the French Revolution anymore. Even though probably, he says, the French Revolution is the foundation of our society. Whereas the Americans, we take very seriously the study of our founding period to know what our principles are. So I've gone through a lot of things here. You need proportional equality in the economics. You also need it in how you elect people to offices. Right? There should be, at 757, there should be a proportion between the monarchic, aristocratic, and democratic elements. This proportion should not just be a numeric proportion. It should also be a proportion of virtue and education. And that's important too, because I think in our own time, when we tend to think about equality, we tend to think about it as numerical equality. And we don't tend to think about, well, how would you weigh virtue and education? Right? How would you weigh virtue and education in a regime? And you weigh virtue and education not just in numerical terms. You can't just weigh them in numerical terms. One of the movements of political science and also of philosophy over the last 100 years is to make it more and more mathematical, right? More and more numerical. Well, there's no way you can measure virtue and education in numerical terms. Right? Just today, I got from Northern Virginia, I got a letter asking me to evaluate a candidate for the seminary. Right? And traditionally in the church, what's the purpose? What is the true origin of letters of recommendation? The true origin of letters of recommendation is to get an honest assessment of the spiritual life of the person. Right? In other words, to get an evaluation of their virtue and of their education. And you ask typically an authority that you trust. Because why? You can't do this numerically. It's just not possible. So you ask 3 or 4 people to evaluate the potential candidate for the priesthood who can be honest about their virtue and education. That's the origin of letters of recommendation. Right? So now when you go, when you go ask a professor for letter of recommendation, typically most professors lie.
What?
Right? Well, just because what can you say if you're not going to talk about virtue and education? What do? Well, what you do in the Ivy League schools is you praise somebody, right? You just say, yeah, basically, yeah. Oh, this person is wonderful. She's the most beautiful, wonderful student I've ever had, and the among all the students I've had, she's in the top 5% of all the students I've ever had. I highly, highly, highly recommend this person. So it's effusive praise. And actually, this is, I think, another area where Catholics are at a disadvantage. You know why? Because I think Catholics, one of the things that Catholic culture tends to emphasize, even when it becomes corrupt a little bit, is sincerity. You are what you are. And people just say what you are. Right? And even your professors will say what you are. And so, so like when it's true. So when a Catholic applies to Harvard, the professors will give a sincere evaluation of the candidate. But like someone who's at Princeton applying to Harvard for graduate school will just get all this effusive, sophistical BS.
Some people do it at some point,
No.
Irrational.
My sister was actually talking about this.
No.
She was saying that the reason why Notre Dame has a hard time, Notre Dame students have a hard time getting to grad school is because just they themselves in interviews.
Yeah.
They don't know how to sell themselves.
Yeah. Well, it's not that they're not sophists.
Yeah.
I remember when I was at Columbia, I realized, you can get a job at a law firm as a copy editor making $20 an hour. The problem is you got to lie in your first interview. There's no way to get the first job unless you lie and you say you have experience.
Really?
So all the Columbia students would just go and lie in the first interview because that's what everybody does. And I couldn't do it, So I didn't get a job. But I think that's one of the. I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a good thing. But it puts us at a disadvantage when you have a culture when everybody is kind of relying on a reputation and this kind of false praise, this flattery. Everyone's relying on flattery. And so the temptation is to give in to the flattery and become a flatterer yourself, as we were talking about earlier, in more vulgar terms.
It's actually kind of funny that you use that phrase for flatterers because in Dante's Inferno they eat.
Yeah.
Don't they eat feces?
Yeah. That's a just punishment if you think about it.
That's why they're brown nosers.
That's why they're brown nosers, yeah.
Do it this summer.
That's where they're free.
Do what?
Is that really what I
I took Dante in a class last semester.
Read down,
It
actually.
comes from Dante.
So fast.
Yeah.
It's follow it.
No, yeah. I know.
When you said that Catholic profs are honest about their students and tell them what they are, I was just picturing you standing up at the front of the classroom and going, "You asshole!" I don't think you've ever done it. Maybe you have, but not in front of me. But I can just picture you. You are an asshole. Or you're a shark. You are a shark.
Oh, I got a shark hat. It's a little. It looks like a shark. I should have brought it. I'll bring it next week.
You should every week you should bestow it on one of your students.
Hopefully, remind me to bring it next week. Because I always forget to bring it.
How big is it?
It's like a baseball
Once I
cap.
read
Oh,
it,
it's a baseball.
Yeah.
I thought it was like this
No.
foam thing has
But, but you could make it bigger. You could make it bigger if you wanted to.
yeah, write it down. Write it.
So,
There.
he goes into all these things, right? You got to have guard. You have to have people on guard to watch against conspiracies, and you have to have people. Basically, he's saying you got to have the CIA and the FBI. You got to have people who watch the society to make sure there are no internal conspiracies. You also have to have people who watch other societies to make sure that they don't basically plan to take you down. You need to slow down innovation and change, right? Because innovation and change can ruin the regime. Your judges cannot take bribes. I mean, this is all kind of common sense at this point. One interesting point. Innovation and change, it's not that you can't have them, but you need to slow them down. Right. This is what France does.
So that goes against, America's all about.
Yeah, no, we're completely.
De Tocqueville says they need to constantly. Innovation is good, but it needs to constantly return to first principles.
Right. You need to constantly, basically. Yeah, you need to account for innovation in the context of the common good. And you may make fun of France all you want, but France, going back to the Reformation, the way it distinguished itself from England, except for during the time of the French Revolution, is that it basically said, whatever changes happen in economics and culture and society, we're going to resist them so that we can incorporate them into our society such that everybody can benefit from them.
Isn't that why the French Revolution happened to begin with, though? It's because they were way too slow to...
No, it happened because the French Revolution is an English black operation that got out of control. It's because the English wanted to make France into England. And so they sent all of their radicals into England to deal with people like Voltaire and Diderot to bring about a revolution that would make France like England. And it got out of control. It's a black operation that got out of control. In other words, it went against even what Plato says you should do. The English did not have a foreign intelligence service just to observe France, to protect England. England is the first country that really develops a foreign intelligence service to go into another country and to destabilize it. The English are some of the biggest, from in the time of the Reformation on, are some of the biggest Machiavellian SOBs in the history of the world. And again, we flatter them. I mean, we never think about the fact, for example, that, and we never present this fact, that the English outlawed the Catholic Church for 400 years. If you were a priest in England, you were drawn and quartered, you saw your intestines burned in front of your eyes, and then they killed you. That's not exactly being polite.
Cheerio.
That's not cheerio. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
Right? But we present England as if it's this, ideal, society we should all look up to. And that's propaganda and flattery. And actually, the way the English primarily changed their society was through creating a kind of system of wealth by which they could use wealth to control the universities.
Isn't that what's happening in the United States?
Yes.
Okay.
The Catholic universities right now in the United States are very similar to what English universities were at the end of the 16th century, right, during the first 40 years of the reign of Henry VIII. Wealth was being used, basically, like when Campion was coming, when Edmund Campion was coming to age at Oxford, he was a guy that was bought off. As a young scholar, he was bought off to be critical of the church. He was an Anglo-Catholic, right? He had kind of Catholic sentiments, but he was an Anglican. And 60 to 80% of the scholars were of that ilk. About 10 to 20% were radical, pro-Reformation Calvinists. And then 10% were just kind of the Fredoso Catholics of this world. Right? And money, basically... No, it's true. In other words, 60% were just sentimental Catholics. But they were bought off to be Protestant reformers because they didn't want to be punished. 10% went along with the regime in a radical way, right? And then about 5 to 10% were people like Fred Fredoso, who were completely excluded and marginalized. And Edmund Campion, there came a point in his career where he said the wrong thing, and so his funder took his money away from him. And then he started fearing for his life, so he fled to Douay, of Douay, Reims, Spain. right? He fled to Douay, and even at Douay, he was still a kind of Anglo-Catholic, but he had a conversion eventually. And then he decided to become a Jesuit, and then when the Jesuits became part of the missions of going back to England to die, I mean, what was Douay Rheims, right? What was it? They trained 20 priests a year to go to England, knowing within 2 years they'd be killed. They were training martyrs. And they did this from like 1580 until 1610 or so. In a big way. The mission got much reduced for complicated reasons in 1610. But at some point, the Jesuits agreed to send 2 of the 20 priests a year into England. And Edmund Campion and Robert Parsons were the first 2 that were sent in. But he was a flatterer in his young career. So I don't know what I'm saying here. What am I saying? What are we talking about? What was your question? I forget the train of thought. Pardon? Yeah, but I don't know what it was about Plato that led us in this direction.
Oh, it's about change. It's a slow change.
Oh, you have to slow change. Right.
And then you went to
Right. Yeah. You got it?
Got it.
But in other words, money was used. Money was used by the English to make change quicker in England. And then the English money was used to try to subvert all of the Catholic countries in Europe. Spain, France, and Austria. That was the goal of the English. That was the goal in some sense of the Enlightenment. Was to subvert the Catholic countries of Europe. And actually that was the goal of Woodrow Wilson after World War I. No, he did. He said the country he most hated in Europe was not Germany, but was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he hoped that through the 14 points, he could bring the definitive end to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You can read about it. There's a Catholic Austrian. This guy's he wrote a great little book called Leftism. Basically, where he shows that leftism is the worst thing ever you could be, is be a leftist. So it's kind of funny. But it's just great to read in our times where everybody, even the Catholics want to say, oh, I'm a leftist, I'm a liberal. I'm a Catholic liberal, right? Well, he basically says, what's the origin of leftism? It's sinistra, right? The left hand is sinistra.
That's awesome.
The first chapter is on the origins of left. Yeah. Leftism is sinistra, dangerous, subversive, revolutionary. Destructive of the family, destructive of social order. So who in their right mind would ever want to be a leftist? But then he writes this awesome history of leftism, over the last 200 years. And he basically shows how leftism is responsible for all the problems. Because leftism is all about innovation and change and money and all, destroying the social order. So his book, Leftism Revisited. Leftism and Leftism Revisited. It's great history. Someone needs to become a historian, and they need to secretly keep his principles in mind, and then write the history of the last 200 years. So that's one of your tasks. Some of you out there.
You snap your fingers. You dissertation on that. You Peloponnesian War and Plato. What's his name? Chrysostom guy.
Libanius.
I'm getting that mixed up with Lilius from the day I'm a kid.
Right. Leftism and Leftism Revisited. The name of the historian, he has an awesome name too. Eric Von Knelt Ledin. I met this guy when I was
talked about him before.
Yeah, I met him in Milwaukee when I was a sophomore in college. He was coming through Milwaukee on a speaking tour. He was like 90 years old back then. And someone at the center of Opus Dei knew him. And so he came to the center for an evening of conversation. And he was pompous and arrogant in all the right kind of ways. So leftism and leftism revisited. I'm sorry, I hope I'm not insulting anybody here. I'm just having a little fun. This is a family establishment. We can have some fun, right?
No problem here.
So, what's the whole point of the section on marriage laws? Right, marriage and marriage laws. What's the whole point of it? Just as in eating food, right? If you notice that a lot of times in this section, he'll go between eating food, drinking, and marriage. So just as in eating food, we would not allow for the extremes of cannibalism, human sacrifice, and starvation. So too, in marriage, we don't want to allow for those extremes of sexual pleasure outside of marriage. Why? There's one line, I wrote it down. I'll get to it eventually. Where it basically says, look, there's three desires. There's the desire for food, the desire for drink, and procreation. The desire for procreation is like fire. It's in some sense, in the human person, it's stronger than the other two desires. And so if you don't tame it, it's gonna lead to the destruction of the citizen. So, just as with food, you would not want to allow for cannibalism, nor would you want to allow for human sacrifice, where you eat the flesh of human sacrifice. You also don't want to allow for starvation. You want to find a way to moderate, and the way you moderate the desire for food is through common meals. And the point is not to have common meals. The point is to think about what's the best way of making sure that you prevent people from becoming fat lards. You know, how can you present someone from being a tub of lard? Right? That's not you. Right? I'm not talking about you.
But I am.
No, you're not. You're the happy me. Because you're very happy.
Oh, I'm embarrassed.
No, St. Jose Maria, there was a guy that lived in St. Jose Maria who had pleasant proportions. Right? And he was and he was very happy-go-lucky. But people were concerned about him, so they had him go on a diet and lose weight. And he became skinny, but he was miserable. He lost his good sense of humor, and he couldn't laugh at jokes anymore, and he couldn't make jokes. He was miserable the whole time. So they told the guy, gain the weight back. And he did, and then he was happy again. So for him, that was the best thing to be. Yeah. For him,
Get the whole sidetrack on this.
for him, that was the best thing to be. For the sake of the common good. Yeah. Aquinas had to cut for him to study, they had to cut an arc out of the circle.
Oh my gosh. Out of the desk.
Right? So
How did he kneel in a pew? Like on those, do they have little kneelers for
I don't know.
quiet?
I don't know. Anyway, so the basic point of the marriage laws is that if you want to have men who are tamed, you have to tame them somehow. You have to tame the erotic passion for procreation. And just as common meals do this for eating, so too you have to have an institution which does it so as to avoid the misbehavior associated with homosexual conduct, and also all the forms of misbehavior associated with heterosexual misconduct. You can't have either of those. And notice, for example, that when he talks about women have common meals too, he actually says that only takes place before they bear children. Right? And so there's kind of a metaphor or an analogy between common meals for eating and then the need for the family. The point is that you need the family to tame the passions of the individuals. Only if you have that will men and women raise their children to live virtue. If you don't have the family, men and women you'll have children that become wild. In other words, with a lot of these examples, what he's trying to do, he's trying to point to human nature and what human nature requires. He's not necessarily trying to point to this particular public policy as the way you're going to resolve the problem. So you need marriage to help people grow in virtue. Not wealth, but marriage. And in fact, he even says you need to find people who don't marry. If you think about it, this is why any religious institution in the Catholic Church that requires celibacy, they have a strict form of discipline. In other words, that's why, and that's why all these things that people don't understand about religious orders, the reason they have them is basically it's a way of recreating the family, or it's a way of disciplining people so as to moderate the erotic desire. Right? So the fact that someone in a religious order can't write to people of the opposite sex, it's basically to moderate the erotic desire, to not let it spring out. The fact that a nun, I know girls who are nuns now, they can't talk to me. I'm not offended by that. They need that to live their vocation. The fact that someone's in a religious order, that they might have to sleep on the floor once a week, or always sleep on a hard bed, that's in some sense there to moderate the erotic desire.
Well,
that's what I was so happy when I was in Rome. When you go into St. Peter's Basilica, when you walk into the nave of the church, on the right and on the left they have statues of all these saints. And the first statue on the left is a statue of St. Peter. What? The first statue on the left is a statue of St. Peter Alcantara, who's a saint basically because of the corporal mortification he did. He was a serious dude when it came to corporal mortification. And at the foot of his statue is a discipline, right? A cord. A discipline is a cord of a rope of like 10 cords, right? That's a discipline. Yeah, with 10 cords on it. And then a cilice, which is the modern equivalent of a camel's hair shirt. It's like a metal belt you would put around your arm or your chest or your leg, which causes discomfort. Mother Teresa's nuns wear 2 cilices a day for like 5 hours a day. I mean, they are the tough dudes of the church when it comes to these things. Right? Well, they have a statue. This is in St. Peter's Basilica. And someone pointed this out to me. They have a statue of St. Peter Alcantara, and at the foot of the statue is a cilice and a discipline. And then there's an angel pointing to these things, and then he's holding a cross, right? And the angel is pointing to these things and touching the cross at the same time, right? So that artwork, Christian artwork, shows you the symbolism of what's going on. So I know this is kind of graphic, but anyway, this is important for people who are celibate. Because people who are celibate need something that disciplines them. Because when you're married, marriage disciplines you. When you're celibate, You don't have that, right? You don't have that. I was telling this last week to the people I spoke to in Detroit. My brothers, when their wives have the children, they don't sleep for the next 6 months, right? Once you have kids, if any of you are called to be married, for the 18 to 36 years that you have children at home, don't count on a lot of sleep. Hey, the boys are here, and you're back already.
Wait, what?
He just finished the MCAT. And he wanted to get here for the last 10 minutes of class.
Discipline.
Yeah.
You drove really fast. Was it in Chicago? Wow.
Basically, no, I didn't tape it. Basically, as long as you have children at home, forget about sleep. I mean, forget about a lot of sleep.
This is true.
Right? I don't have to worry about that. So it makes sense. Like, one of the things we're asked to do is one night a week to like sleep on the floor or something like that. Because why? Because we have to suffer a little bit. It's only right that we suffer a little bit.
I think it's interesting that you say that like religious orders and whatnot have to have like common meals and a schedule to keep to and stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's that people today don't understand that for religious orders, or if they don't understand that at all. Like, because
It's
there's
both.
so many families that don't understand.
Yeah, it's
the
both. It's both.
importance of common meals and stuff.
It's both. They don't understand it at all.
Yeah.
But even people sometimes who are part of a family, a good family, sometimes fail to see some of the rules that religious orders have or institutions have as a way of basically disciplining their passions so that they can live their vocation. And it's not because the things that oftentimes, it's not because the things that they're renouncing are bad. It's simply because they need to renounce something to discipline their passions. And also so as to protect against. It's not that the thing is bad, but it's to protect against any spark that, if it were sparked, could lead to bad things. Throughout the history of the church, the biggest problems are caused by priests and nuns who abandon their religious orders or the discipline of the priesthood or religious life. And they go off and do their own thing. Typically, whenever you get, like for example, in the Middle Ages, whenever you get a crowd of peasants who are about to kill Jews, it's usually that crowd is being led by a priest who has left his diocese or who has abandoned his religious order but is still a priest. Because he's given up the rule of his order.
Martin Luther.
Yeah.
Wasn't the reason he got all stressed because he wouldn't say the office for like 3 weeks.
Right.
And then he would just sit in his room and catch up.
I think another thing that needs, just to go on here, another thing that needs to be kept in mind is that ultimately, in Plato's understanding of things, and I think this is also true, freedom needs to be protected in the city. And the truth needs to be protected in the city. Right? And this is, I think, also true with the family. If any of you become parents, you need to protect the potential vocation of your children. Just as a university needs to protect the truth. Why? The tendency always is for the passions to present themselves as liberators. But remember, when they rule in the soul, they ruled with despotic tyranny.
I remember that was the first time I actually believed it.
Right? Yep. So the tendency...
That's why I was like, this guy said he said
But this happens in the university, right? In the university, those who defend the truth over time will always be those who are persecuted and excluded, especially in the environment of academic freedom, right? So, This is kind of a counterintuitive point. The difficult thing is not for it to have academic freedom. The difficult thing is how do you protect the truth? I would say a lot of the problem of celibate vocations in the United States, or like the priesthood, it's not that God is not granting those vocations. It's that families are not creating an environment that protects those vocations such that their children could see them and respond to them. And actually, the way to protect a vocation, if you're a parent, is not to encourage your children necessarily to think of it. No, it's true. What Plato says is that the guardian of the city needs to be like a watchman. If you're a parent, you need to watch your children carefully. And you need to see, does my child show signs of having a vocation to celibacy? If that's the case, I need to somehow, without telling that to my child, right? I need to have a kind of environment which is Catholic, in which these vocations are respected. And I need to almost try to, without saying anything, I need to create the circumstances within which my child could meet someone who could help him. It's not part of my family. Right? It's just like if you're a parent, and actually one saint that I was reading said, if you're a parent, you shouldn't let your children date until you're pretty sure that their vocation is to marriage. Because otherwise, you could be leading them into attachments that would prevent them from seeing their vocation to give themselves to God completely. And this saint says, usually though, by the time a child is 14 to 16, you can if you're a parent and you watch closely and you know your children, you can kind of know, more or less. These things are not exact sciences, but you can kind of know. And then this saint actually says, well, at that point, again, you should very discreetly try to, organize parties and social gatherings where your child could meet someone, that could lead to marriage.
And bring them the fiddlers one day.
No, but again, it's got to be. But that's where the thing of ultimately, if you have good Catholic schools. I mean, this saint was speaking in Italy, where families do much more socializing with each other, maybe than in the U.S.
Yeah, they always have a 3-hour long.
Right, and schools are not seen in the difference between European countries and the U.S. is that in European countries, schools are not seen as your social network, right? Whereas in the U.S., high school or university, that's much more seen as your social network, in addition to where you get your education. So this saint was writing in the 19th century for Italians, right? So it's not exactly, but something. I mean, in some sense, American schools, Catholic schools, play that role.
Just out of curiosity, what saint was that?
Bosco.
Okay.
And actually, St. Francis de Sales says similar things. A lot of saints say that same thing. I mean, if you can pick up those pieces of what they say. So St. Francis de Sales says it. John Bosco says it. And then actually St. Josemaria says the same thing. So you can think of freedom and virtue and the truth and goodness in universities the same way I just spoke to you about children and their vocations. There's parallels between all of them. We hardly got through anything. No, but it's good because we've got to. I think we've got a number of fundamental principles that we got into here.